Western observers encountering China in the early modern era were stunned by its vitality and material prosperity. Writing in 1736, the French Jesuit Jean-Baptiste du Halde summed up the awestruck reactions of Western visitors to China. The riches peculiar to each province and the facility of conveying merchandise by means of rivers and canals have rendered the domestic trade of the empire always very flourishing. The inland trade of China is so great that the commerce of all Europe is not to be compared therewith, the provinces being like so many kingdoms which communicate to each other their respective productions. 30 years later, the French political economist Francois Quesnay went even further. No one can deny that this state is the most beautiful in the world, the most densely populated, and the most flourishing kingdom known. Such an empire as that of China is equal to what all Europe would be if the latter were united under a single sovereign. China traded with foreigners and occasionally adopted ideas and inventions from abroad, but more often the Chinese believed that the most valuable possessions and intellectual achievements were to be found within China. Trade with China was so prized that it was with only partial exaggeration that Chinese elites described it not as ordinary economic exchange, but as tribute to China's superiority. Confucianism. Almost all empires were created by force, but none can be sustained by it. Universal rule, to last, needs to translate force into obligation. Otherwise, the energies of the rulers will be exhausted in maintaining their dominance at the expense of their ability to shape the future, which is the ultimate task of statesmanship. Empires persist if repression gives way to consensus. So it was with China. The methods by which it was unified and periodically overturned and reunified again were occasionally brutal. Chinese history witnessed its share of sanguinary rebellions and dynastic tyrants. Yet China owed its millennial survival far less to the punishments meted out by its emperors than to the community of values fostered among its population and its government of scholar officials. Not the least exceptional aspect of Chinese culture is that these values were essentially secular in nature. At the time when Buddhism appeared in Indian culture, stressing contemplation and inner peace, and monotheism was proclaimed by the Jewish, and later Christian and Islamic, prophets with an evocation of a life after death, China produced no religious themes in the Western sense at all. The Chinese never generated a myth of cosmic creation. Their universe was created by the Chinese themselves, whose values, even when declared of universal applicability, were conceived of as Chinese in origin. The predominant values of Chinese society were derived from the prescriptions of an ancient philosopher known to posterity as Kongfuzi, or Confucius in the Latinized version. Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, lived at the end of the so-called Spring and Autumn period, 77 to 476 BC, a time of political upheaval that led to the brutal struggles of the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC. The ruling house of Zhou was in decline, unable to exert its authority over rebellious princes competing for political power. Greed and violence went unchecked. All under heaven was again in disarray. Like Machiavelli, Confucius was an itinerant in his country, hoping to be retained as an advisor to one of the princes then contending for survival. But unlike Machiavelli, Confucius was concerned more with the cultivation of social harmony than with the machinations of power. His themes were the principles of compassionate rule, the performance of correct rituals, and the inculcation of filial piety. Perhaps because he offered his prospective employers no short-term route to wealth or power, Confucius died without achieving his goal. He never found a prince to implement his maxims, and China continued its slide toward political collapse and war. But Confucius's teachings, recorded by his disciples, survived. When the bloodletting ended and China again stood unified, the Han Dynasty, 206 BC AD 220, adopted Confucian thought as an official state philosophy. Compiled into a central collection of Confucius's sayings, the Analects, and subsequent books of learned commentary, the Confucian canon would evolve into something akin to China's Bible and its constitution combined. Expertise in these texts became the central qualification for service in China's imperial bureaucracy, a priesthood of literary scholar officials selected by nationwide competitive examinations and charged with maintaining harmony in the emperor's vast realms.